The rain ticked softly against the windows tonight, as if nature itself was whispering warnings too quiet to understand. You're safe now, maybe tucked under a blanket, perhaps headphones blocking out the world. But not everything stays out just because you lock the doors. Let me tell you a story. A 42-year-old man named Jasper used to work the overnight shift at a gas station just off a forgotten stretch of highway in Oregon. There was rarely any traffic after 2 a.m. And that's when Jasper said the veil between this world and whatever lies beyond it started to feel thinner. It was sometime in late October. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Jasper always kept a small heater under the counter near his stool because the chill in that station was unnatural. It always found its way under his skin. That night, around 3:12 a.m., he heard the chime above the door. He hadn't seen headlights pull in, but he wasn't entirely surprised. Some folks around there were locals that didn't give warning. Deliveries sometimes, or wanderers passing through. A woman stepped inside. She was soaked, absolutely drenched, as if she'd stood in the rain for hours. She had a vintage green parka that looked like it belonged in an old war film, and her boots squeaked on the tiles like they were rubber. Though Jasper swore later they didn't look like boots at all. More like shells. She never spoke, just walked slowly through the aisles. Jasper remembered thinking that something about her seemed off. Her movements were delayed, like she was processing the idea of walking half a second behind the actual motion. She stared at the bottled water for several minutes. He asked her if she needed anything. She didn't respond. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she turned to walk out. No purchase, no words. Just glancing at him once with cloudy eyes that seemed less alive and more like pits reflecting no light. That's when he noticed. She wasn't leaving wet footprints. The floor around her shimmered, but it didn't get wet. That night, the security footage glitched. When reviewing the tape, the woman wasn't visible. All that showed was the door opening, and Jasper speaking to no one. The camera moved erratically, like it was afraid to look. She began showing up more frequently. Always in the rain. Always between 3 and 3:30 a.m. No one else ever came during those visits. And Jasper started noticing things changing in the station. Items moved, lights flickered. It was as if her presence bled into reality and warped the edges of something he couldn't see. The final time she came in, Jasper saw her standing at the slushy machine. But instead of pulling the lever, she was staring at the reflection inside the stainless rim. When he glanced closely, he realized the image in the reflection wasn't matching her posture. It was smiling. She wasn't. The machine sputtered on by itself. Red cherry goo poured onto the floor. When he stepped around the counter, she turned to face him and took a step forward. But the station lights exploded, not flickered. Literally burst into shards. The smell of burnt ozone filled the shop. She vanished. No footsteps out, No door chime. Just gone. Jasper quit that night, left the keys in the register and walked into the storm. They say someone else works the shifts now, but people claim the woman sometimes shows up still. Always in the rain. Always between 3 and 3:30 a.m. But now, she speaks. Let's move to another story. This one comes from an EMT in Pennsylvania. We'll call him Greg. Greg was dispatched one stormy night after a call came in about an injured hiker in the woods near a small state park. Lightning had knocked a branch free and pinned the individual against a cluster of rocks. They came in via the service path, off-grid, no GPS coverage, relying on handwritten directions left at the ranger's station. His partner, a woman who had only been with the unit for a few months, stayed nervously quiet most of the ride. When they arrived near the coordinates, the injured man was already in shock, but not from blood loss. He had a wide gash across his temple and muttered repeatedly, "It's in the trees. Don't let it call you. Don't let it call." They assumed he was struggling to stay conscious or maybe suffering a concussion. They stabilized him and tried to ready the gurney. But the storm made everything difficult. While strapping him down, Greg saw something. At least he thinks he did. A long figure crouched or hanging from the crooked arm of a tree. Just where the rainfall thinned under dense canopy, it appeared upside down, as if gravity were an optional rule. It had defined limbs, but the face, or what should have been, was more like moss over bone. Whatever it was, didn't flinch as lightning shredded the sky behind it. It just seemed to watch, neck craned in an anatomically impossible way. He closed the ambulance doors fast. On the way back, the patient began whispering a sound Greg said he still hears in his sleep. Not words, just this always falling whistle, like wind spiraling inside a bottle. His partner? She turned off the cabin lights and simply muttered, "It hears us more clearly when our lights are on." Greg finished the report back at headquarters, but when logging the trip, he realized no name had been attached to the caller or the injured. There had been no record of a person matching the patient's description in the emergency database. All he found later, weeks later, while checking archived patient logs, was a scribbled note. Caller claimed to be tree-borne. Field record lost in rain. No signature, nothing else. Another story, this one quieter, and yet it unsettled me more than most. A woman in her 30s, let's call her Presley, moved into an older farmhouse alone after finalizing her divorce. It was peace she'd bought, literally, tucked far into the Appalachian foothills. She loved the rain, and in that house, the sound echoed like lullabies along the attic walls. The first few days, nothing unusual, just adjusting to the isolation. Then, one night, she heard whispering behind the headboard of her bed. At first, she thought it was the wind curling through the window creases, but then it became rhythmic, persuasive, like someone was humming through teeth, singing words she couldn't quite pin down, but always the same 5 syllables. "Let me come home now." She started sleeping elsewhere. At first in the living room, then she bought a cot and moved downstairs entirely. But it didn't follow the bed. It followed her. The whispers came from behind mirrors, inside closets. Once, through the water in her coffee pot. She poured it down the drain. The steam hissed like breath and whispered back, Presley decided she had imagined it. Maybe it was loneliness soaking into her mind like the storm had soaked the back lawn day after day. She cut herself off from caffeine, started practicing breathing exercises, even tried meditation. But the humming didn't stop. It grew clearer. A week later, during a downpour that turned her road into a small river of brown water and gravel, the sound came again. But this time, it wasn't muffled or distant. It was right next to her. She was brushing her teeth in the small downstairs bathroom that faced the woods out back. The mirror had long since fogged over, and yet, behind her shoulder, she swore she saw a shape. A pale hand, just resting on the edge of the shower curtain, nervous fingers twitching in anticipation. She spun around, heart in her throat, nothing. But the mirror wrote something for her slowly. As condensation curled and thinned, letters began to take form. Like invisible fingers had been waiting all along for moisture to reveal their final script. Let me out. She moved out the next day, left everything she owned in that house. Furniture, clothes, even her wedding rings. She never went back to collect them. When a local real estate agent went to assess the place, he claimed there were dozens of phrases like that on every mirror, but not written in the fog. Etched into the glass. Thousands of tiny scratches forming a whisper. You could read only when wet. Sometimes the rain calls things closer to us. Not from the sky, but from deep within. Like it awakens the memory of things that shouldn't be remembered. This next story came from someone working security at a supply depot in Louisiana. We'll call him Eli. Eli's job was what most people would call chill. Show up at 6 p.m., walk a big square around the building every couple hours. Make sure no one was breaking in or injecting stolen gas into unmarked vans. Most nights, it was boredom with a flashlight, but storms always made it longer. You had to stay inside unless it was life-threatening. One night, thunder rolled in early, a heavy wall of lightning fracturing over the swampland like veins of glass. So, Eli stayed in the supply shack and tried not to fall asleep. Around 2:40 a.m., a shadow moved across the only window in the shack. He figured it was a large bird, maybe an owl, but then the motion sensor monitor next to him flickered. Section 5. The far storage container near the tree line was blinking red. Eli got up, reluctantly put on his poncho, and trekked out. The rain had thinned, but the wind was vicious, charged with the kind of static that made your neck itch. The container was closed. Locked too, but he shined his light through the narrow slits along the side and caught reflection. Eyes, not red or glowing. Just ordinary human eyes. Staring back, blinkless. Except when he opened the crate. Nothing was inside, and no tracks around it either. The mud remained untouched. No even davits where boots should have sunk in. It got worse. Over the next few weeks, Section 5's alarm would trigger randomly. Always during storms. Each time someone looked sick after being dispatched to it. Nauseous, lightheaded, as if time skipped while they stood near the door. But the cameras never showed anything, just static in bursts. Eli said it started whispering his name along that hallway between the fence line and storage crates. Not out loud, just barely behind his thoughts. Until one night, a co-worker snapped and ran screaming into the woods, bleeding from his ears, yelling about wrong sounds and crawling skin from speakers. They never found him. Let's leave the woods, at least for now. This next story takes place in a large apartment complex in Vancouver. The building was older, 60s construction, with those long, dimly lit hallways where footsteps echo from nowhere and night feels heavier even indoors. Marissa, a tenant on the third floor, had moved in just a few months earlier. She worked night shifts at a hospital, so her schedule was flipped. Her bedtime typically began around 6 a.m. Rain poured heavily that morning. Marissa had just fallen asleep when something woke her. But not a sound, just a sudden, bone-deep panic. Like her body sensed a presence before her mind could piece it together. She turned toward the window, expecting to see the endless gray of morning storm clouds. Instead, she locked eyes with a woman standing outside her third-story window. No ledge, no balcony, just the sheer side of the brick building and the flattened glass pane between them. The woman's face was smudged, like water damage on a painting. Features blurred into each other, but still somehow watching. Marissa screamed. By the time she flipped on the light and ran to the window, the figure was gone. Maintenance said they found water damage just above that side of the window outside. But there was no way anyone could have stood there without falling 3 stories. Or without at least leaving footprints or a ladder. Over the next few weeks, Marissa began seeing that dripping silhouette in reflections. Puddles by the elevator, mirrors in the gym, even slicked surfaces in the laundry room. Never when she was looking directly, only when caught off guard. One night, as thunder cracked across the skyline and lightning webbed the clouds, the fire alarm tripped. Hallways filled with panicked neighbors, but no one saw smoke or fire. Marissa tried to descend the stairs, but the lights failed halfway between the third and second floor. Her phone light flickered, and behind her, she heard saturated feet on metal stairs. Not stomping, not quickening, just slow, persistent steps trailing her. She turned. The silhouette was visible for just a moment. Face still blurred, but this time it raised a hand and waved. Marissa never lived there again. Back to the countryside now. Have you ever heard of the monk? It's what locals in a small English village began calling whatever it was that haunted the narrow road near the graveyard by Mannock Hill. The road ran past an 18th century cemetery that had long since filled. An old abbey once stood there too, long demolished. But the rumors remained. Late rain hit the stones especially hard there, and drivers reported consistent tire failures on that road. More than 3 dozen in 1 year alone. But it wasn't just mechanical failures. Pedestrians would report seeing a figure ahead blocking the road, dressed in black robes, hood drawn up. As you approached, it wouldn't move. But if you blinked, it was suddenly closer, like film skipping forward without warning. One motorist, a teacher named Jonas, claimed that as he approached the figure During one heavy downpour, he slowed down, only for it to vanish suddenly and then reappear in his rearview mirror. It was in the back seat, or at least the image of it was. Panicking, he swerved and crashed into a ditch. Locals found him repeating, "He hummed, he hummed." He was in the glass. Dashcam footage, recovered later on, showed no figure. But for 3 seconds during that drive, the audio track twisted, unmistakably, into Gregorian chanting, ancient, hollow. Jonas refuses to drive to this day. And finally, for now, let's end with a shorter story. One told from the perspective of a child, but retold by the adult he became. In Missouri, during one particularly vicious thunderstorm in 1999, a boy named Carter was home alone. His mother had gone to pick up his little sister from a friend's house 2 towns away. Lightning tore up the sky, and the house lights dimmed. He was watching cartoons. Then the screen glitched. The colors faded to grayscale, and his favorite characters stood motionless in the frame, as if the animation had ended. But none had left. They were staring directly out of the screen, where Carter sat. Then, in unison, they slowly turned their heads to look beyond the scene, toward the window in the cartoon background. Through that window, in the cartoon world, was a man watching them from outside. And Carter said he heard soft knocking behind him, from his own real window glass. Carter didn't want to look. Something in every bone told him, do not turn around. But just as quickly as it started, the cartoon sprang back to life. Color returned. The characters danced across the screen like nothing had happened at all. He told his mother about it. She called it an overactive imagination. But years later, he discovered that on that exact night, emergency dispatches were flooded with 911 calls from people across the region claiming a tall man was watching them through their windows during the blackout. No break-ins, no crimes, just observation. Some police described the intruder as soaking wet, despite no water on the floor, and appearing to wear a grey cloak or drape. Like film left in the rain too long. It was never caught on camera. Let's shift the storm. Mark was a college student in Connecticut when he found a part-time job at a local library. Not in the glamorous rows of paperbacks or behind the checkout desk. No, Mark was given the strange task of basement index auditing. Basically, crawling through deep archives of old paper card catalogs and making sure certain documents existed. Most were newspaper scans, old microfilm, census records nobody cared about anymore. The floors beneath the library were ancient, some going back to the 1800s, built long before the university had funded major updates. And one rainy Thursday, halfway through his shift in sub-level 3, he heard what he thought was violin music. Soft, somber, faintly familiar. So faint that when he turned off the old clanky ventilation fan, it grew clearer. He followed it. 10 doors down from his normal file room was a locked archive they didn't use anymore, due to ventilation issues and mold. Mark had to squeeze beneath a slightly caved beam, passing massive iron shelves corroded with age. But the music was there, consistent, like someone was rehearsing a funeral hymn. It echoed off the stone. Mark reached the final room and saw the light flickering underneath the door. He peeked through the observation slot and saw, under that flickering bulb, a woman sitting in a chair, motionless, with a violin in her lap. The bow was moving, but Mark swore it wasn't attached to her hand. It just glided. He backed away slowly. The library dismissed him, told him he must have accessed a secured zone, but he still dreams about her. The lightning pulsing behind her form. The way her song seemed to pull him forward like gravity. He described it in journals as a melody made of memory, but not a pleasant one. And here's something you may not expect. Not all horrors come from ancient structures or endless tree lines. Some show up through the most ordinary places, like smart speakers. This came from a woman named Isabel. She lived alone in a 700 square foot flat in Chicago's South Side. She used a popular voice assistant to play meditation music at night, especially when storms passed through and made the walls creak. She noticed something small at first. The speaker would delay its responses. When she said, "Stop music," it waited 2, sometimes 3 seconds before obeying. Then it started responding before she said anything, as if it predicted her commands. The worst came on a Saturday night during a city-wide thunderstorm. She woke up at 3:14 a.m. to a soft voice coming from the speaker. Not music, not white noise. A conversation, not with her. The speaker repeated, "No, I can't open the door again, not yet." Then static and silence. She said, "Alexa, who was just speaking?" The reply came, "You were." But she hadn't spoken at all. Freaked out, she unplugged it and tossed the speaker in a drawer. The next day, she went to the drawer to show her neighbor the device. But it was already plugged back in and playing that same voice, calm and wet, as if underwater. "Once you've heard me, I'm always near." Isabel moved west 2 months later. She doesn't use speakers anymore. She doesn't even let herself listen to music while it rains. Let me return now to something older. A retired railway technician told this story. Name was Robert, though that's likely changed to protect identity. He said during the 1980s, part of his job involved inspecting outlying signal cabins, many of which were scattered kilometers away from the nearest town. Most were unmanned. Most had been decommissioned. One in particular, Station 17B, was avoided even by the overnight crews. Electrical anomalies, radio signal drops, and in one case, an entire shift companion going temporarily blind after entering the cabin. By the time help arrived, the man's sight had returned, but he described seeing sheets of eyes in the dark, blinking slowly like a zipper unfastening down a hallway. Robert was sent to 17B during thunder season to inspect cable degradation. He parked his service vehicle half a mile out due to flooding and walked the rest of the way with a torch. The moment he entered, the rain intensified tenfold. So loud, it nearly muffled the intermittent click, click, click from inside the communications console. 17B had been disconnected for years, but the receiver was still active. He powered up the desk. The console showed incoming, on loop. The voice that followed was distorted but perfectly human. I remember your steps. You came here before. I was awake even then. Robert pulled the battery leads and turned every breaker in the shack. All systems off, the voice kept speaking. Calm, male, distant. You shouldn't have come back, but now you'll come again and again and again. When Robert checked the call logs stored in the analog backend, he found something insane. Each winter storm, since 1978, someone had answered a call at that station. Names were signed, but every name was of a worker who had disappeared. Robert put in for early retirement. Less than 6 months later, Station 17B was destroyed in a freak fire caused by lightning. But registered weather data showed no lightning within a 10-mile radius that week. Just relentless, ceaseless rain. Sometimes weather doesn't hide monsters. It activates them. Let's go to a new voice now. A woman emailed this next one herself. No second-hand retelling. Her words stuck with me. It happened before streaming was a thing, she wrote. We still watched DVDs or Sunday night movies on cable. I was 12. My grandpa had passed away 2 weeks prior, and I was helping my mom clean out his den. Inside one of the filing cabinets, she found a handheld recorder. The old kind, dusty, covered in masking tape labels. She hit play. At first it was just the usual. Audio notes. February 9th, planting okra. March 21st, check engine light still on. Boring stuff. But one entry, dated April 4th, was different. It started with 3 seconds of silence. Then, I hear them on the roof again. Rain. Light patter over tape hiss. They always come when it rains, but they never knock. The voice was wrong. It was her grandfather. Yes, but shakier, slurred, like he'd been up for days. And then he whispered, "They don't need the front door if you dream of them." The girl dropped the recorder. Later that night, she says she did dream. A window in the ceiling. A man standing over it. Mouth open, just silently staring through glass as if floating above her bed. Arms stretched wide despite the impossibility of rain that high up. She never listened to the other tapes. I don't blame her. I've saved this one for last. You'll understand why soon. This story came from someone who admitted he hadn't spoken of the events in over a decade, not because of disbelief from others, but because he was afraid that simply remembering it might make it happen again. Let's call him Darren. He worked for an independent parcel company in Washington state doing overnight deliveries into deep rural zones of Evergreen Highway. Most homes out there were miles from their nearest neighbor. Forests pressed in on the roads to the point that your high beams just lit up a wall of dripping green. One night in late November, during a roaring storm, Darren was delivering an overnight package to a home he'd never been to before. The GPS went dead 2 miles before the turnoff, and he followed what looked like wheel ruts barely visible under sheets of rain. After 10 minutes of creeping forward, tires slipping, lights diffused into fog, he saw a house, two stories. Victorian, not lit from the inside, but a single porch light blinked rhythmically, as if it was coded. There was no mailbox, no signage. He pulled up, exited his van, and immediately felt something strange. There was no ambient noise, no rain hitting the trees, no wind, no forest chatter. Just the crunch of his boots and his own breathing. He approached the porch, knocked. No answer. As he turned to leave, his eye caught something in the front yard, barely illuminated by his van's headlights through the fog. Multiple figures, 10 or 11 of them. Not people, not exactly. They were spaced out across the lawn, some hunched, some tilted, standing the way mannequins might if they'd been dropped on broken legs. They weren't moving, but something in his gut told him they had just moved. He backed toward his truck, but realized he'd left the package on the steps. Then the porch light, the blinking one, went out for a full 3 seconds. When it came back on, the figures were closer, 5 or 6 feet closer, still not moving, still not clear. It was like staring into static that had formed vague outlines of human suffering. He sprinted for the package, grabbed it, turned to toss it onto the porch, and stopped. There was a face pressed against the front window now. One he hadn't seen before. Pale, hollow-cheeked, with a mouth too long, open like it had frozen mid-scream. It was perfectly still, except the rain didn't move around it, didn't fall normally. It bent around the face like glass in water. And that distorted scream? He claimed he heard it in his own head. Not out loud. Inside. Like someone turned music into a thought and placed it in the center of your mind without permission. Darren launched the package at the window and bolted. He backed the van down half the road before turning it around. For the next 3 nights, during sleep and waking, he swore he heard what sounded like wet fingers drumming on glass. On the 4th night, someone delivered a package to his doorstep. No brand, no label. He didn't open it until a week later. Even then, only under the presence of close friends and 2 bottles of courage. Inside was a tape recorder. A reel-to-reel, old, heavy. He played it, static. Then, a chorus of voices whispering in layered, distorted tones. Had to find you. You delivered us. We are inside every storm now. You built the road. We only followed. He destroyed the tape. But whatever came through didn't leave. He sees strangers on every rain-drenched bus bench. People standing under broken street lamps who seem to be looking for cover. Figures on news reports just slightly distorted. One time, he swore he watched a local newscaster blink mid-sentence, and just for a single second, her eyes turned solid black. The rain returned the next morning and hasn't left since. Now, maybe by this point you believe what you've heard. Maybe you don't. Maybe they don't want you to. Maybe these stories slide into your ears like soft old tales told by a fire. Maybe they settle into your thoughts like fog on a windshield. Easy to wipe away, But you'll remember one, at least one. Maybe tonight, maybe as you nod off. And when you do, when the windows rattle from late thunder, listen closely. Listen for the faint tapping on the glass. Not from something asking to come in, but something already there, not knocking, drumming. Like it's remembering your rhythm, like your stories next, and now you've heard them all. The ones told in the storm, the ones the rain helped wake. Perhaps some were guardrails, warnings. Perhaps others were invitations. But they're finished now.